The Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, head of the Romanov dynasty, was forced to give up the throne after 23 years. The vast country was in the throes of a revolution, and the new rulers wanted him out of the way. So 5 months later, the Tsar and his family were exiled to Siberia. A year later, they were moved again, this time 200 miles west to Ekaterinburg, a small town in the foothills of the Ural Mountains. Meanwhile, Vladimir Lenin, leader of the Bolsheviks, was consolidating his hold over Russia. The country was embroiled in a bloody civil war as counter-revolutionaries known as the White Russians resisted the Bolsheviks and fought to restore the old order. By the summer of 1918, they were closing in on Moscow and planned to press on to Ekaterinburg. However, when they reached the house where the Tsar had been held prisoner, it was empty. Nicholas II, his wife, 4 daughters, and heir, Crown Prince Alexei, had vanished without a trace. Nicholas Romanov was born in St. Petersburg on May 18, 1868. He was brought up in great luxury, while most of the country lived in abject poverty. He succeeded his father, Alexander III, as Tsar in 1894, and that November he married the half-German Princess Alexandra of Hesse, one of Queen Victoria's many grandchildren. 2 years later, in 1896, 28-year-old Nicholas was crowned. He was the 18th Romanov since 1613 to sit on the Russian throne. As Tsar, he ruled over 130 million people and an empire which stretched from Europe to the Pacific, including Poland, Finland, the Baltic states, and much of Central Asia. He was supported by the Russian Orthodox Church and a handful of land-owning aristocrats who controlled much of the country's wealth. Meanwhile, even though serfdom had been abolished in 1861, the majority of Russian peasants still endured great hardship as they struggled to live off the land. By the early 20th century, the rural Russian population was growing so rapidly that they flooded into the towns and cities looking for work. But there were few jobs to be had, and many found themselves even worse off than they'd been before. Resentment towards the Tsar's autocratic regime began to grow. So in February 1904, in order to divert growing discontent at home, the Tsar embarked on a war with Japan as both countries fought to seize territory in China and Korea. He sent the Imperial Russian fleet halfway around the world, only to see it smashed to pieces at the Battle of Tsushima. News of the humiliating defeat caused riots in St. Petersburg and Moscow. Hundreds were killed, and the unrest was quelled only when the Tsar reluctantly agreed to allow the formation of an elected parliament, or Duma. But he had little intention of fulfilling his promise of sharing power, preferring instead to be guided by Rasputin, an illiterate and drunken monk who ingratiated himself with the court by persuading Alexandra, the Tsarina, that he could cure her sick son, Crown Prince Alexei. Alexei had been born with hemophilia, and the Tsarina was in a constant state of fear about his health. Then on June 28, 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. A month later, World War I broke out, when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia began mobilizing a troop to support Serbia, and Germany came to the aid of Austria-Hungary. Things went disastrously for Russia from the start. By the end of 1916, after a series of devastating defeats at the hands of the superior German forces, the Russian army was on the point of collapse. This so dismayed the Tsar that he decided to travel to the front and take personal control of the troops as their commander-in-chief. But with no proper military training, he proved even less competent than his hapless generals, and the situation deteriorated. It was not long before the ill-equipped, exhausted, demoralized, and half-starved troops had had enough. So too had the workers at home. In March 1917, led by Alexander Kerensky, they rose up against the state. At the same time, the army rebelled, and the Tsar was forced to abdicate. 5 months later, he and his family were exiled to Tobolsk, a bleak outpost in Siberia. It was a time of great instability in Russia, and Kerensky, who was a moderate, struggled to cling on to power. In October that year, he was swept aside when the Bolsheviks, or communists, led by Vladimir Lenin, took over in a violent coup. Lenin was shrewd enough to realize that even though the Tsar no longer sat on the throne, he still represented a potent symbol to the country's counter-revolutionaries. So, toward the end of April 1918, the royal family was moved to a secure house at Ekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains, 200 miles west of Tobolsk. It was a journey from which they would never return. In December 1917, the new Russian government led by Vladimir Lenin signed a peace treaty with Germany and pulled out of World War I. This left him free to tighten his iron hold on Russia and her people. But by the spring of 1918, Russia was embroiled in a bloody civil war between the Bolsheviks, or communists, led by Lenin, and the White Russians, who were being aided by the US, Britain, France, and Japan. In April, Tsar Nicholas II and his family were transferred from Tobolsk to Ekaterinburg. They were held in a place called the House of Special Purpose, which was surrounded by a high fence. Even though the Tsar, his family, and various personal aides, including physician Dr. Evgeny Batkin, were prisoners, they were allowed to move about freely within the grounds of the house. The Tsar seemed almost to enjoy his new existence. He spent time with his family, worked in the garden, went for walks, and called himself simply Nicholas Romanov. However, Russia was still locked in civil war, and even though it was unlikely that the counter-revolutionaries would want to restore the Tsar to the throne, Lenin saw him as a threat. He knew he had to act quickly. The White Russians were closing in on Moscow. If they succeeded in capturing the city, it would not be long before they advanced on Ekaterinburg and released the royal family. Lenin and his closest associates toyed with holding a show trial for the Tsar, but the idea was quickly dismissed. Then, as they pondered the future, a dark and terrible solution began to take shape. On July 4th, 1918, a new person was put in charge of the Tsar. He was Yakov Yurovsky, a member of the Bolsheviks' secret police. 8 days later, Philip Goloshekin, who was in charge of the Ural Bolsheviks, was called to Moscow. There his duty was made clear. The Tsar and his family were to be eliminated. 4 days passed. July 16th began as a typical day for the Tsar and his family. They rose as usual at 9 a.m. and gathered for morning prayers. The rest of the day went by routinely. However, after they had gone to bed that evening, a truck drew up outside the gates and a dozen grim-faced men filed silently into the house. At around 10:30 p.m., Yurovsky roused the royal family and their servants and told them they had to go down to the basement. He said the White Russians were about to attack, and they had to be moved for their own safety. None of them had any idea what was going on, and they waited nervously in a bare room. Then Yurovsky burst in, flanked by the men who had arrived at the house earlier. He bluntly told the shocked family that because attempts were being made to rescue them, they were to be executed, and the men immediately opened fire with revolvers. Nicholas and his wife Alexandra died instantly. The girls were not so lucky and ran about the room screaming as bullets ricocheted off the walls. Finally, they were clubbed and bayoneted to death. It took 3 shots to finish 14-year-old Crown Prince Alexei.